Hello, everyone, and welcome back. A couple of things. First of all, in today's lecture, we're going to be taking a look at some late works by Frank Lloyd Wright from the post-World War I period. And secondly, I'm going to divide today's lecture into two different parts. I received this suggestion that dividing the lecture in that way would make it easier for all of you to access it. So what you're looking at right now is Later Wright lecture part one, but be aware that there's also a part two. And the cutoff will be between my discussion of the Johnson-Wax complex and my discussion of Taliesin West. I'm not so sure that it's going to be equally divided, but it will be. So we took a look at Frank Lloyd Wright in the first part of the course when we were taking a look at developments upon arts and crafts. And there were a few important points about Frank Lloyd Wright that we had taken a look at or that we had examined. First of all, his relationship with Louis Sullivan. He was a pupil in Sullivan's office for a number of years, and he seems to have had a particularly close relationship with Louis Sullivan, certainly understanding and learning an awful lot about Sullivan's approach to design. Secondly, when we take a look at Wright's own architecture, we see a few distinctive qualities or characteristics to it. First of all, his sort of arts and crafts became increasingly non-historical over the years. He certainly was taking a look at vernacular traditions and was certainly influenced by the timber construction of Japanese vernacular architecture. But over the years, he's going to become increasingly non-historical. Secondly, he always advocated tying the architecture to the landscape in one way or the other. And thirdly, we saw that he didn't shy away from taking advantage of what machines could do or what could be mass-produced or even new structural technology in some of his buildings. So all of these distinguished him from some of the other arts and crafts architects who were practicing in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. But perhaps most importantly, we also saw that Wright was beginning to break down the traditional definition of interior space. Whether it was connecting the interior to the exterior with the use of a lot of glass and with a common ceiling that would extend from the inside out and sort of visually connect the inside space to the outside space, or whether it was creating openings in the interior rooms that would break down the corners and that would therefore defy any capability of really understanding at a glance what the geometric volume of that room was. But both of these are going to be highly influential, and both of these are going to be things that he is going to continue with through his late career. The connection between interior and exterior, and also playing with space, right? Breaking down the definition of interior space. When we left off, Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1900s, 1910s in Chicago, he was an up-and-coming architect. He was a family man. He and his wife were raising what today would seem to be a large family in a well-to-do suburb just to the west of Chicago. And he was also developing the family farm up in southern Wisconsin, or rather a site near the family farm in a locality known as Spring Green, Wisconsin. And he was beginning to develop a large complex up there that was going to be a combination family home, architectural studio, architecture school, commune, working farm, community center, et cetera, all sort of wrapped up into one in this really interesting building that he was designing and developing on a hilltop that overlooked a lake on the property. All good, right? All moving ahead, in a perfectly socially acceptable way. But in the years to come, Frank Lloyd Wright's personal life and Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural career are going to become intertwined in some very unusual ways. And so I'm going to go into his personal life a little bit in order to provide some background to problems that he was going to experience with his architectural career and how that ended up really contributing to a different viewpoint about his own architecture and what he was here to do. This rising architect, this family man, ended up having an affair with one of his clients' wives, or rather the wife of one of his clients. Mrs. Cheney also, her maiden name was Bothwick, Mama Bothwick. He and Mrs. Cheney started having an affair, and they ran off to Europe together. Mr. Cheney granted his wife a divorce. But this was a point in time in Illinois law. I don't understand all the details of family law in Illinois in the early 20th century, but this was a point in time in which to get a divorce, you needed to have the consent of your spouse. So Mr. Cheney granted that consent to Mrs. Cheney, but Mrs. Wright was not interested in being divorced. And so she would not grant Frank Lloyd growing and developing up in southern Wisconsin. In the early 20th century in Chicago, this was scandalous. And clients began to distance themselves from Frank Lloyd Wright just because they didn't want to be associated with him. So this led to some problems with his architectural career. But it was only going to get worse. Because one day when Frank Lloyd Wright was in Chicago, he got a phone call, a rather cryptic phone call saying there's a problem up in Wisconsin, up at Spring Green. You need to catch the next train up and get up here immediately. So he went to the train station, and while he was there, he ran into Mr. Cheney, who also got that phone call. And for as awkward as that must have been, they both went up to Spring Green and discovered that one of the servants had set a fire in the kitchen while Mrs. Cheney and her children and some relatives of Frank Lloyd Wright were at lunch in the dining room. And as they were running out of the dining room to escape the smoke from the kitchen, the servant was waiting for them with an axe and ended up killing Mrs. Cheney, her two children, and I think there might have been one or two more casualties. This was scandal that made headlines across the nation. And if Wright's social standing was sketchy before this, after this, he was an absolute pariah in Chicago. And there were no clients to be had. Very soon after Mrs. Cheney's death, there was a woman who showed up in order to offer her condolences to Frank Lloyd Wright. And she ended up offering more than just her condolences, and very soon moved in with Frank Lloyd Wright. And also very soon, she ended up alienating just about everybody because she was unbearable. Nobody liked her, least of all Frank Lloyd Wright, but Wright decided that he had a debt of gratitude towards her, and so continued living with her. Eventually, Mrs. Wright is going to get tired of the situation that she found herself in, and years after Frank Lloyd Wright has had his affair with Mrs. Cheney, she's finally going to grant him a divorce. And Wright decides that the way to resolve the problematic relationship with the woman who had shown up to comfort him was to marry her, thinking that that would resolve everything. So they married, and they very quickly separated because it didn't solve things. Soon after their separation, while he was still married to a second wife, he met this young Serbian dancer, Olga Manolacevic, and he soon started living with her. And 4 years later, the second Mrs. Wright gave him a divorce from his second marriage, and he then married Olga Manolacevic, and the two of them stayed together for the rest of his life until his death in 1959. And so it was in 1928 that finally his personal life seemed to be resolved in a way that was both long-standing and also socially acceptable. And it seemed that things might be moving in a good direction for Wright to begin to accept more clients in the Chicago area or in the Midwest. But between the mid-19-teens, when he became such a scandalous figure in the Chicago area, in 1928, when finally his personal life seemed to have been resolved in a way, there weren't a lot of commissions in Chicago or in the Midwest. And he began for looking commissions elsewhere. On the West Coast in California, where people perhaps didn't worry quite so much about the architect's personal life, he ended up getting a few commissions for houses that gave him the opportunity to experiment with a material that he developed, or rather a construction system that he developed known as textile blocks, which brings together specially designed concrete molds for individual blocks that would then be built in two closely spaced but parallel concrete block walls connected with reinforcing rods so that there would be airspace between the two walls, thereby creating chases for utilities as well as trapped air for insulation. He had the opportunity to experiment with that a little bit. He went even further afield and ended up accepting a couple of commissions in Japan, the most famous of which was the Imperial Hotel, which you see in the image on the right. But finally, in 1928, it seems that things are beginning to settle down for him, and he could begin to hope that there would be some renewed career, some second act to his architectural career in Chicago, when all of a sudden the Depression breaks out, and there were very few projects for any architect after that. So between one thing and the other, Frank Lloyd Wright went through some extended periods of difficulty, personal difficulty, career difficulty, and then with the Depression, economic difficulty, career difficulty, etc., etc. During all of this, Wright began to develop a very highly defined sense of who he was and what he was here to do. And he began to take on this self-imposed prophetic role for architecture and society in the United States. Now, I use the word prophetic fully aware that that word has some very serious religious overtones to it. Frank Lloyd Wright did think in highly spiritual terms about who he was and what he was here to do. And he felt that it was his role to bring America kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And if we take a look at a few different projects that he took on, we begin to see how he conceived of his role. He developed an urban scheme that he called Broadacre City. This was not a real urban project. Rather, this was his envisioning how Americans would move forward in organizing the built environment. He felt that the old, the by then typical organization of commercial center, suburban donut around the commercial center, and then factories around the periphery of a city, he felt that that was outmoded. And with some of the developments in telecommunications, developments in transportation, as well as the economic need produced or brought on by the Depression, he felt that in the future, people were not going to have to congregate in the typical American city. Rather, they'd be able to spread out over the landscape, either telecommute or get into commercial centers or shopping centers with individual means of transportation. And in the image on the right, you might be able to see those little individual helicopters that he imagined every family would have. But he also felt that each family was going to have to be quasi self-sustaining and live on an acre of land where they would produce a lot of the food for themselves. And so he felt that the population would spread out in a very different way over the landscape. And he promoted that with these images of what he called Broadacre City. Again, not a real project, but something that he felt was going to show Americans the future for their development of the built environment. He also began to develop a house type that he called the Usonian house, which he felt was going to be an economical house with the size and shape of spaces necessary for modern American life. He felt that Americans didn't need to have a formal living room and a formal dining room and a kitchen that was completely separate from them. And he felt that the old traditional models for domestic architecture were not appropriate for the United States anymore. And so he began to develop this new sort of house, which was much more condensed, didn't have some of those superfluous spaces, used readily available materials that were not all that expensive, milled wood and brick and other things that we would all be familiar with today, in spaces that were much more open and flowing from one social space to the next, not particularly large, but something that he felt was going to be more appropriate for Americans in the 20th century. He had a number of real commissions for Usonian houses, and in a way he felt that this was a new house type that could proliferate. And from one Usonian to that house to the next, there are some pretty substantial differences. It's not sort of a uniform cookie-cutter house type. He did allow himself to react to the landscape and to take some creative gestures with each individual project. But still, something that he considered to be part of his prophetic voice in architecture. Moving forward beyond the 1940s and into the 1950s, we begin to see Wright entering a new phase of his architecture where the buildings begin to use primary geometry in a very different way than what we saw previously. And we see things that seem almost to be futuristic in the way they use geometry and in their expression. So when we take a look at buildings from Wright's late career, and the buildings that we're going to take a look at are from the 30s up until the end of his life in 1959. I'm going to examine each of them in a particular way. I'll analyze all of them in terms of the form and the space, but we're also going to take a look at them in light of that self-styled prophetic role that Wright had. And we'll be asking ourselves, what was the message that Wright was trying to communicate with each of these individual projects? The first building that we're going to take a look at is probably one of his most famous ones, a house in rural Pennsylvania known as Falling Water. The patron of Falling Water, Mr. Kaufman, was a wealthy businessman from Pittsburgh, and he had obtained a piece of rural property, wooded property, just a little to the south of Pittsburgh, and he wanted a vacation home there. He commissioned the work from Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was designed and built in the 1930s, which, by the way, was during the height of the Great Depression. The people in Wright's studio were extremely happy to have this commission because Mr. Kaufman was a paying client. And during the Depression, there weren't that many paying clients. But the people in Wright's studio were beginning to get pretty concerned because Wright didn't seem to be doing much on the project. He had visited the site. He had accessed all sorts of information about the topography of the site. But back at Spring Green, at the architectural commune that Wright had formed, he really didn't seem to be doing much in terms of putting pen to paper and designing the building. One morning, out of the blue, they get a phone call in the office, and it's Mr. Kaufman. He's in Chicago, and he tells Wright that he's going to be taking the train up. he would like to have lunch with Wright, and then maybe after lunch they could take a look at the drawings that Wright had about the design of the house. And Wright agreed to all of this. When he hung up the phone, the people in Wright's studio were in absolute panic because there wasn't much to show Mr. Kaufman. But Wright sat down and very calmly began drafting plan, section, and elevation of Falling Water in order to show Mr. Kaufman what he had been thinking about. And what became clear to Wright's associates at that point in time was that Wright had this building pretty well designed, even though he hadn't produced the drawings. He was so adept at envisioning architecture that he didn't need the drawings in order to communicate to him what the building was going to look like. He didn't need the plan in order to understand the section. He didn't need the section in order to understand the elevation. He pretty much had it all in his mind, and he was very quickly able to put together drawings that he then showed to Mr. Kaufman, received Mr. Kaufman's approval, and they went ahead with the working drawings. And apparently, maybe this is an urban legend, but apparently the relationship between what Wright produced and what was actually built was actually very close. When we take a look at Falling Water, we're going to see that it sits in the landscape in a very particular way. And it seems that that is the prophetic voice that Wright was hoping to sound with this building. How a building in the 20th century in the United States should fit within the landscape. Very rocky and steep slope. And Wright sort of sets the building up on one side of a ravine that overlooks a creek that runs through the bottom of the ravine. If we take a look at the building, we're going to see that it's essentially a composition of two different combinations of materials and form. On the one hand, we've got stone that had been quarried locally, and so it has the same geological makeup of the stone on the site, which is then laid up in a sort of rough coursing in these vertical walls. And you can see that in these images. That's one part of the building. And those stone walls enclose smaller spaces that are either private or utilitarian. Whether it's a kitchen, whether it's a study, whether it's a bathroom, they're kind of enclosed within these vertical rectangular walls. Contrasting with that, we've got these extended reinforced concrete planes that cantilever out far beyond the final extent of those walls in order to hang over the creek and the ravine below. And both of these come together in a combination that is very clearly not a naturally occurring event, right? This doesn't look like a log that's fallen over. It doesn't look like a mushroom that's growing on the site. But it's also very clearly intended to coordinate with the landscape in a very particular way. Tied to the landscape in terms of the material of the stone and the coursing, but also very clearly a man-made composition within the landscape. The way that you approach this building is pretty interesting because the approach road is actually on the other side of the creek from the house itself. Now, when we take a look at Falling Water, and when we take a look at those horizontal planes of concrete, it's interesting to tie that back to some things that Wright was experimenting with, even in his early career in Chicago. If we take a look at either of the two houses in the upper two images there, including the Roby house, we saw the way that he extended these horizontal planes out from a fireplace core in what he called a pinwheel plan. So the geometry here was these horizontal planes that would extend out. And he's certainly picking up on that in these enormous cantilevered overhangs of Falling Water. But again, you approach the house from the far side of the creek. And so you come across the bridge and are able to look at the house as your car drives across the bridge. And then the drive makes a left and goes into this narrow space between the house and the hillside. And so you find yourself in this area where on the one hand you've got these stone walls, and on the other side you've got the rock of the ravine itself. Um, Now, interestingly, we also see that there are these reinforced concrete beams that appear to tie together the concrete planes that you saw when you were crossing the bridge and the hillside. It appears the Wright is trying to make the suggestion that the large cantilevers of the house itself are made possible because structurally all of that is tied into the hillside. Um, so anyway, an interesting connection with the site in this case being, however fictitiously, a structural connection between the site and the structure. Uh, the level that you enter into the house on is obviously going to be the social space. Large, open, multi-purpose space, both living room, dining room, office space. Connects to a kitchen, which is the space that's sort of contained within those vertical stone walls, and also has a couple of very large terraces off of the living space that overlook the ravine and the creek below. On one story up from this, you have some private spaces. You've got bedrooms and bathrooms and studies. And then on the uppermost level, you've got some more private space, a small suite of rooms that has a large private study and a bedroom and bathroom up at the uppermost floor. When we've got this combination of systems, the vertical stone walls and the horizontal concrete planes, the question becomes, how do you enclose space? How do you separate the interior from the exterior so that there's climate control on the inside? If we take a look at the perimeter wall of at least part of the social space, we're going to see that the handrail of this floor level, which is an exterior handrail for some of the terraces, is also the lower part of the wall on the inside. And you can see it here in the section. And then he used large panes of glass in order to enclose the space between the wall and the bottom of the concrete plane up above. So certainly using sheet glass, modern material, produced in factories, and held together with standardized details, in this case some sort of metal mullion, which is holding those individual pieces of glass together. If we take a look at some of the spaces that are enclosed within those stone walls, we're going to see, again, fairly large pieces of sheet glass, metal mullions, but it's interesting to note the way that he's allowing the sheet glass to run right into the stone walls without any sort of mullion connecting the glass to the stone wall. In the bedroom, if you take a look by the fireplace and above that chair, if you take a look at the way that the glass seems to go right into the stone wall, or in the kitchen down below, again, glass going right into the stone wall. An interesting detail, something that he developed, and not your typical way of structurally supporting a piece of glass. So exploring with some of the details, but also making use of modern materials once again. It's going to be interesting to see the way that Frank Lloyd Wright not only allowed this house to compositionally fit within the landscape, but the way that he brought you into direct physical contact with the landscape in the design of the house. Now, we've already seen the way that he suggests that the concrete structure of the house, those horizontal planes, we've seen the way that he suggests that those are structurally tied into the hillside. After the building was completed, the Kaufmans asked him to design a covered walkway which would lead away from the house and up the hill to have at least a little bit of a covered hike away from the house. And so Wright's later edition includes the roof structure that you see in the other upper image here. But beyond these things, Wright is also giving people the opportunity to have direct physical contact with the site. He very carefully noted where the top of one of the rocks was in the ravine, and he centered the house on that, had the floor level in the living space just a little below it, and made sure that the fireplace, the hearth, what always for him was an important element within the design of the house, located right on the top of that rocky outcropping. And so around the fireplace, if you were to come up to snuggle up next to the warmth of the fire, if you were to use that large urn to heat water, if you were to come up to throw logs onto the fire, you would be having direct physical contact with the site, specifically that rocky outcropping, which was going to be the center of the home. In addition, Wright provided ways that you could descend from the main living area down to the level of the creek, so that if you wanted to, you could walk down those steps, sit down on the landing, maybe take your shoes and socks off and dangle your feet in the water. And he also created a creek-fed plunge pool, which you can see just to the right of that little platform, so that if you wanted, you could come down and actually get into the water and soak in the water of the creek. Again, direct physical contact with the site. So whether it's in the selection of materials, whether it is in the suggestion that the structure is tied into the landscape, whether it's direct physical contact with the site, Wright is designing this house in order to show 20th century America how you can live within the landscape and how architecture can relate to the landscape. Now, one interesting point is that in the design of the reinforced concrete planes here, Wright pushed reinforced concrete to its upper limits. As a matter of fact, he pushed it a little beyond what he should have. There are structural problems with the building. It obviously has not fallen down yet, but still, there are some problems with the structure. And it just shows that for as much as Wright was interested in embracing the machine and making use of modern materials and modern technology, he could also push it a little bit as well. The next building that we're going to take a look at is a corporate headquarters in a small town in Wisconsin from the 1930s, 1940s. And the prophetic voice that Wright was trying to sound here is what corporate architecture should be like. Johnson Wax was a corporation that grew very large in the 19-teens, 1920s, and it's still around today. It's known as Johnson & Johnson. At a point in time in which it would have been perfectly normal for this growing corporation to move from the small town in Wisconsin to a larger metropolitan area, say Chicago or Minneapolis, Johnson Wax, the administration of the corporation, decided that they wanted to stay put. They felt that they had an investment in Racine. They felt that they had a debt of gratitude to pay to the people of Racine. And they also wanted to have a relationship with the staff of Johnson Wax that was very different from your typical corporate organization. And so they had a particular way of running the corporation, and Frank Lloyd Wright was tasked with finding an architecture that was appropriate for that. Johnson Wax was able to obtain 2 city blocks in downtown Racine, and they united the 2 of them into the campus for the corporate headquarters. If we take a look at the bird's eye perspective in the upper image here, what we're taking a look at in the lower right is going to be the administrative wing. What we're taking a look at in the upper left, including that vertical tower there, is research and development. They were located on the 2 different city blocks, but the campus joined those 2 city blocks together. It was designed in phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1 was going to be the administrative wing. Phase 2 was research and development, and we'll take a look at it in that order. When we take a look at the exterior of this entire complex, for as much as they had a connection to Racine, the complex very clearly turns its back on the city and looks in. We're going to see that it looks in, whether it's into interior space in the administrative wing or whether it's into an exterior courtyard at the base of that research and development tower. But it looks in. And enclosed by brick walls, at the upper part of those walls, and enclosing some of the interior spaces and enclosing elevated walkways, we see Wright using a new material in a very creative way. Pyrex glass was something that was developed and that was being mass produced and used quite a bit in chemical labs and for research and development. And there were Pyrex tubes that were being developed, tempered glass tubes, which were both strong and also heat resistant. And Wright was interested in finding an architectural application for these tubes. And so it was this material that he chose to experiment with in enclosing some of the space on top of the enclosing brick walls around the complex, in using this material to enclose the different floor levels in the research and development tower, or to cover some of the walkways which would run from one part of the complex to the other. There was miles of Pyrex tubes that he used in this, which meant that there were going to be miles of joints that needed to be kept and maintained. Southern Wisconsin gets bitterly cold in the wintertime. There's snow, there's ice, there's a lot of rain, even in the spring and the fall, and even in the summer. And using a material that requires the constant maintenance of miles of joints between individual pieces of glass, not such a good idea. Nevertheless, Wright was interested in experimenting and creating this new effect with this modern material. Wright also was interested in experimenting with the structure that he was going to use here. He had this idea for the structural element that he wanted to use in the administrative wing. It was going to be a port-in-place reinforced concrete pier that had a cap to it at the top, a circular cap at the top, and that cap would almost be tangential to the next one, but one of these would support the next, and the cap could be roof or it could be floor structure, depending on whether it was a multi-floored part of the complex or whether it was a tall interior space covered with these structural elements. And he called them lily pad columns, obviously, because of the similarity to lily pods if you were down in the pond itself. So he developed it, he did the structural calculations to it, and even though we've got a very tall element here with a broad circular horizontal structure that comes down in a very thin column and an even thinner ankle down on top of the foundations, he was sure that this was going to be structurally stable. The building authorities in Racine that were charged with examining the building design and providing permits that would include an examination of structural stability were not so convinced, and they rejected the design because they had never seen anything like it, right? They weren't convinced in the least that this was actually going to stand. So they rejected it. And so in order to overcome that, Frank Lloyd Wright decided that he was going to stage a stunt. He had one of these actually built, and he called a press conference where he invited not only members of the local press, but also the building authorities from Racine. And while they were there, they began loading one of these individual structural elements. And they loaded it with sandbags and with sand up into the point where it was supporting the combination of live load and dead load that these could be expected to hold. And it did just fine. And Wright said, keep on loading it. And so they kept on loading it. They added more sand and added the weight onto it. And it got to the point almost of holding 9 times the amount of combined live load and dead load. Almost 9 times of what was required before it started to show structural failure. And so at this point, with the press there, the building authorities were obviously pretty embarrassed, and they had no other option really but to allow Wright to go ahead with it. So he did. And this was the structural unit that we're going to see in the administrative wing. The administrative wing, in its center, is this large open area, which is where the secretarial pool was going to be. These days with computers, we don't need secretaries the way they did back in the 1930s, 1940s. But at that time, when most of the executives didn't know how to type or didn't have the time to type and file, there was a whole army of secretaries that were there to type and to file. All of these people were going to be at the floor level with this really wonderful space covered by these lily pod columns. And around the perimeter is where the executive offices were going to be on at least two different floors. And so Wright felt that this organization of the space, this connection between the executives and the secretaries, and this structural system was going to create the proper environment for corporate management. And so he felt that this was his architectural expression for what the space for corporate management ought to be like in order to foster the sort of very supportive, almost paternalistic organization that Johnson Wax promoted. Phase 2 of the project was going to be the research and development section, and the most important element there was going to be a very tall research and development tower, basically a set of research labs that would be stacked vertically. When Wright thought about tall buildings, he had a very different conception from the norm in the 1930s. To the left, we're taking a look at a diagram of William LeBaron Jennings' structural system. Point load system of thermally insulated steel with the possibility of a little bit of a cantilever to the outside edge, where there would be a curtain wall. Wright thought differently about tall office buildings and skyscrapers, and he looked to a natural prototype in order to understand what skyscrapers could be and what they should be. He looked to the tree, and a tree with a tall central trunk has structure and the transfer of minerals and liquids from the roots up to the leaves and then back down. So a combination of structure and, if you want to call it that, utilities in that central core with all of these branches coming off of it. And so that's going to be Wright's prototype for skyscrapers. He's going to think of it in terms of central structure and utilities with floor levels that cantilever off of it. One great example that we can take a look at is the Price Tower in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, where we've got this central core that's composed of four individual structural slash elevator towers with radiating wings, and then floor levels that cantilever off of those radiating wings. He called it the tree that escaped the forest, and it was originally designed as mixed use. It was going to be office space as well as residential, but today most of it is a hotel. And if you ever go to Bartlesville, you can make a reservation and stay there. Kind of interesting to stay there and to see the spaces. But that tree that escaped the forest is also going to be the prototype that Wright is going to use for the research and development tower at Johnson Wax. And if we take a look at this section, we can see that there is this tall central core, which is going to be structure, off of which all of the individual floors cantilever. But it's also going to be circulation. This is where the utilities are going to be fed, as well as human circulation in an elevator that rises through the center of this tower. If you take a look, you can see the way that it comes down to a very narrow base before it goes below grade and hits the foundation. And furthermore, he expresses that. It's very clear that all of this is supported on a very small structural core at the bottom. It's also interesting to note the alternating extent of the cantilevered floors. Every other floor extends to the outside edge of the building, meaning that the alternating floors, which are pulled back a little bit, allow one floor level to connect somehow, visually maybe if you look over the edge or combined airspace, one floor connects to the one below. What we're taking a look at the outside of the building then is going to be those Pyrex tubes that are stacked as exterior building envelope that connect alternating floors. And so we're really looking at two floor spaces when we look at the outside edge of the building. Hard to imagine how they could actually contain the spread of fumes and vapors in these research labs if one floor connects to the other in the way that we saw in the building section. Nevertheless, what we have here is Wright's experiment with a tall building, right, a skyscraper in miniature, but also giving a very distinctive character to the research and development wing of the whole complex. It's interesting to note that Wright designed this complex in the 1930s, 1940s, after the time in which skyscrapers became the accepted norm in American culture for corporate headquarters, and even after the time when international modernism was becoming associated with corporate America. And so we see Wright really sounding a prophetic voice here, right? What is it that, what is the appropriate architecture for corporations in America? And how can that architecture foster a very different relationship between the corporation and the people who work for the corporation? And that's the prophetic voice that Wright was hoping to sound here in Johnson Wax. So this is where the first part of the lecture is going to end, but please keep your eyes open on Blackboard for Late Wright Part 2, where we'll pick up and I'll take a look at Taliesin West and also the Guggenheim Museum.